In this modern interconnected world, states are relying on each other for the national interests in terms of economy and defense assistance. China and India are also relying on each other for the national and regional interests despite having border issues. There is a famous proverb in international relations by Henry Kissinger that, "World has no permanent friends or enemies, only benefits." States in an international forum deal according to their national interests. World politics moves around this proverb and states deal with each other according to their interests. Looking into India-China's diplomatic relations, one can see the best use of the proverb. However, India and China have border disputes, regional competition, but despite issues, both states having deep economic ties. India and China shared decent diplomatic relations, but there is a rift between their relations in terms of ideological difference, hegemonic competition, and strategic cooperation with different blocs, and more importantly their border dispute at Tibet side. Despite all ongoing issues between China and India, both have great economic relations with each other in terms of trade and Bangladesh-China-India-Myanmar Economic Corridor, BCIM-EC, which they signed in 2013 when China announced its Belt and Road Initiative to connect the world through one road, Iyer, 2017. In 1954, India and China signed an agreement on Tibet. This agreement was historic in the history of China and India for trade and bilateral relations. Prime Minister Nehru promotes the slogan of Hindi Chini Bye Bye. All is going well between India and China, but a sudden escalation of war disrupts the diplomatic and trade relations in 1962. The war fought on the point of Aksai Chin, nearest point of Assam. The rift between two started when China used force to repress Buddhists in Tibet, forced them to leave to their native place in 1959. On the contrary, India supports them and grants asylum to the Dalai Lama. Indian gesture of humility breached the Panchsheel agreement while interfering in internal affairs of China, which affects the relation of India and China and leads to the border conflict. The India and China shares 125,000 square kilometers of the disputed border from the three different sectors. One, the Aksai Chin Plateau, which is on the western side of the Xinjiang province and claimed by both India and China both. 2. The second sector was the borderline of McMahon, where India claims the boundary and China had reservations. 3. And the third sector belonged to the Tibet dispute with Indian provinces of Himachal and Uttar Pradesh.
China and India are regional competitors as well. They belong to two different ideological blocs, both of them striving hard to achieve maximum economic goals to have hegemony over the region, whereas India goes for the private sector to achieve economic reforms, and on the other hand China opt for industrial development and facilitating foreign trade to build up economic industry. China and India acquire their economic growth with different approaches, but they also learned from each other's experiences too. From the late 1970s, India's export and trade increased with China. India shared intensive trade relations with China till 2008, which was the peak of their trade. Afterwards, imports from China slowed down due to expanding trade deficit between two. The main reason behind the cutting off trade with China was the exports of Indian goods with China, which remain low in terms of trade and import ratio always remain high, which also devalues the Indian domestic industry. So, India somehow shifted her trade relations with the US. Post-Cold War, India and China, as third world countries, emerge as economic powers in the region. Despite regional rivalry, India becomes one of the largest trading partners in terms of imports from China. China invests in heavy industry, while India promotes the private sector. Both countries influence other developing countries in the region. Where China and Pakistan shared economic and defense relation to encounter Indian influence from Asian region, and also Pakistan and China have a border dispute with India, and Pakistan perceive a serious threat from India. Despite having a common enemy, China and Pakistan had cooperation in the development of heavy industry in Pakistan, which brings Pakistan and China more close, which alienates India. So, India started its economic influence on its neighboring countries such as Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Bhutan, Myanmar. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Manmohan, India and China have cherished friendly relations, and their trade relations also had boost at that time. In 2013, China and India announced Mutual Cooperation Project BCIM-EC. BCIM has the potential to generate trade, investment, and communication among the member states. There were 3 T's were prioritized under the BCIM, which comprised trade, transport, and tourism, TTT, with time evolved as TTE, trade, transport, and energy. It is Chinese approach to revive old silk and maritime route to expand its trade and reshape the geopolitical relations, and it will automatically boost Chinese economic growth and influence in the region. The clash between China and India has been witnessed when Pakistan-China announced China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, in 2015, which passes through the disputed territory of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, POK, and protests over it and assumed ditched by China, and also perceived that China's BRI initiative as a trap to overtake the regional hegemony and global market. India and Bangladesh presented alternative special zones to have an economic boost. On the other hand, India had announced Kaladan Multimodal Transit Transport, KMMTT, sponsored by Japan to connect Calcutta with Sitwe port of Myanmar, while Bangladesh proposed alternative corridor of BCIM, which includes Chittagong, Yangon Kunming, and Thailand Malaysia Singapore. So far, India wants to curtail ongoing Chinese influence from the region as China is developing Gwadar port as an investment in Pakistan. So India started investment in Central Asia via developing Chabahar port in Iran and wants to develop transit route to Afghanistan, which pass through Pakistan by overpassing China from it. Despite having a rivalry with China, India is one of the largest trading partners of China. On the parallel side, India extended her trade relation with the US while shifting her dependence from Chinese goods to meet the trade deficit as well meet the demand of public goods, and this was the effort to cut off Chinese influence from the region. Analyzing the economic growth of China and India from the past 5 decades. China achieves world highest per capita by providing cheap labor and services to the world to attract their industry towards China. These all are Chinese economic policies and strategies to gain maximum benefit while moving to GDP of China. China becomes the economic hub, developing heavy industry, exporting arms to the world, and at domestic level industry China excel in agricultural reforms and manufacturing cheap domestic goods at cheap prices, which results the dependence of world manufacturing industry on China because of manufacturing of reasonable goods at low market prices. However, India excels in the private sector as mentioned above. They only keep the focus on modern technology in the field of IT and pharmaceuticals, which boost their GDP but cannot overtake China's economic growth nor become regional hegemon, but maintain stronghold East-South Asia through economic supremacy and military power, and now expanding its influence in Central Asia, investing in Chabahar port in Iran and reconciliation of Afghanistan economy with the US. As the US and India fear that China will overshadow their presence in Central Asian region through regional stability via economic investment in terms of development. India started doing investment in Afghanistan to stabilize its economy and counter Chinese influence from the region. US supposed to be a bottleneck between China and India's economic and diplomatic relations, as both India and the US find China as their economic competitor, but both have trading relations with China. The exports from China always remain high as compared to imports, which increased the trade deficit between these countries. However, the Barack Obama administration took the Chinese BRI project as an economic development project, but President Donald Trump administration perceives a serious threat to US hegemony. Soon after joining the office, President Trump demands to cut off trade deficit with China as it increased so high as well. Trump announced to have a close economy to counter China global market hegemony and revive their economy as well, because the increasing ratio of unemployed persons in US and war on terror and Iraq war damaged US economy so hard. The emergence of China as a global market and one of the world's largest economy portray threat to the US hegemony. For instance, India and the US collaborate by boycotting Chinese goods, shifting their trade relations, and expanding their investment in Afghanistan to counter Chinese influence from the Asian region. As if China holds economic control on the Asian region, then the US loses its military dominance and India will never become a regional hegemon. However, India and the US strategy slow down the trade with these two countries but will not affect the global image of China. But the sudden attack of pandemic COVID-19 paralyzed the global economy, which the world economy so hard. In this chaotic situation, President Trump is playing blame games by blaming China for the pandemic, which demeans his national image as well, and his racist policies make the US against him, and the world is appreciating China for her strategies to tackle pandemic. India and China have strong diplomatic relations despite of having border issues of Tibet since 1962, and US plays vital role to ceasefire the dispute, which turns down the diplomatic relations till 1975, but the diplomatic relations resumed in 1976. India and China signed the agreement in the late 1980s. In that agreement they declared the Galwan region as ammunition-free zone. So, whenever conflict erupts in the region, it will not affect the nature of the region. Moreover, after the ceasefire on border, both states did not violate the agreement, but the border dispute again started in 2016, which is still going on. Recently, Indian forces violate the line of actual control on June 15, 2020, from Galwan Valley side. This incident happened after 1 week of the meeting of high military officials from both sides agreed on the peaceful bilateral agreement to resolve the border issue. Mr. Zhao said that, once again crossed the line of actual control for deliberate provocation when the situation in the Galwan Valley was already easing. Whereas China accused India of violating its territory, on the other hand, India blames China for violating its border sovereignty first. However, it was reported in news that no single fire was fired, but more than a dozen soldiers died in this hand-to-hand scuffle in Galwan Valley. Soon after the tension started, after 1 week, India announced to ban 59 Chinese apps and restaurants from India due to the security of the state and public affairs. Moreover, after the China-US trade war initiated, India also cut off its trade relations with China and shifted its tilts toward the US as discussed before. It seems that Galwan Valley tension might be deliberately initiated by India and the US to ban Chinese goods and firms. As soon after India's announced to ban Chinese, the US also announced to ban Huawei and Chinese firms. To curtail the Chinese market influence and shift their trade dependence from Chinese goods. Despite of having border rift between these two civilizations, both states share strong bilateral and diplomatic ties in terms of economic relations post-Cold War era. However, China and India are regional competitors and having disrupted border issues. But still, India remains the largest trading partner of China, and it also provides a huge market to Chinese goods. Although the strategic partnership and strategic cooperation with the US and Pakistan create certain binaries between India and China. Ultimately, the ongoing trade rift between China and the US affects trade relations of India and China due to their close strategic cooperation between India and the US, but somehow, China maintains a balance between its terms with India and Pakistan. Most importantly, China never intervenes between India and Pakistan affair. But in a current situation, where border issue again erupts between India and China at one side, and on the other side, they are trying to resolve the border dispute to maintain peace. This dispute might slow down the pace of trade between two but does not harm the diplomatic relations much, as China believes in economic development and expanding its market broadly. Moreover, China keeps its national interest first and foremost, and India cannot cut its ties with China as the world is relying on Chinese goods. If they will cut the diplomatic and trade relations with China, but they cannot meet the public demand and don't have industry as well. In this modern world, for survival, it's an obligation to have diplomatic ties with neighboring countries, as you cannot survive alone in this world. Especially when you are surrounded by rivals and you have to be more diplomatic towards them.